We know the grid is undergoing massive change, which creates massive opportunities for local energy. The Energy Changemakers podcast offers rich conversations with industry leaders to help you and your company capture opportunities to build a decentralized grid. I'm your host, Elisa Wood. Welcome to the Energy Changemakers podcast. Hey everyone, Elisa Wood here from Energy Changemakers. It's become increasingly clear that if local energy is to advance at scale, the distributed energy industry needs to work more closely with city and town planners. So I was excited to learn about the work of Hillary Brown, former director of the Urban Sustainability Program at City College of New York and author of the new book, Revitalize, Resettle: How Main Street USA Can Offer New Beginnings for America's Climate Displaced. Her work is fascinating because she's planning much further into the future than most of us. She foresees climate migration occurring in the U.S. in the coming decades, a mass movement of population from the coasts to the middle of the country. This would create economic opportunity for communities in central states if they start planning soon, and chaos if they don't. Local energy, local clean energy, will become crucial for these communities as they draw climate migrants. She's got some good ideas about what communities should do now to get ready. I learned a lot from this conversation. I think you will too. Here we go. Hi, Hillary. Thanks so much for being with me today. I absolutely loved your book, and I am so excited to talk to you about it in person.
I'm so pleased you liked the book, and thank you very much for having me. I'm really interested in having this conversation.
Well, this book isn't about energy per se. In researching climate migration, you came upon many of the same conclusions that this audience does in terms of microgrids and distributed energy and local energy. You also offer a new value proposition for the technologies, one that shows the role that I think they would play as populations become displaced because of climate change. But we'll get into that a little bit more as we talk about your book. Let me start by just asking why you wrote this book. What inspired you? How did you come upon this topic?
Yeah, good question. My interests and previous books had been about next generation infrastructure. And in my background teaching urban sustainability, I really was interested in the prospect of what are we going to do with respect to climate. I have an increasing awareness of the plight of many Americans, especially underserved Americans, in failing rural places. And so I'm particularly interested in these left behind communities that have long hemorrhaged the youth, wealth, and particularly well-being. I mean, behind the book, there's this notion of we're living today with the consequences of this urban-rural disparity because we know that at least 15% of rural communities live below the poverty line. And they've become geographically marginalized. They become hostile to government. So I've really long considered how we might begin to reimagine rural life in particularly viable places. And so I've turned my urban sustainability knowledge to the prospect of rebuilding life there as climate change, in fact, reshuffles our population.
Yeah, it's fascinating because your book is both pertinent in terms of today's politics, and it's also, of course, pertinent in terms of climate change. So you talk a lot about the concept of climate migration. Can you explain to this audience what that is exactly?
Yes. We're already seeing the mobility of people moving away from places that are sustaining, continuing flooding. We have Florida's coastal cities, and the Northwest wild urban interface is another area where people have sustained damage or smoke inhalation. And so there is an ongoing movement of people. I do begin the book with what I consider a really ironic effect of population movement in this country over the last few decades. And people are, in fact, ironically, relocating to places in harm's way. So literal climate hotspots like Florida, the extreme heat and water scarce Southwest, and just as one example, North Carolina, for every buyout by FEMA of coastal property, it's been noted that 10 houses are built in the floodplain.
Wow. 10 houses are built for every one that's bought out.
Yes. We just have this perversity about living near water. Millions of us will be at risk long before the end of the century. The statistics I've heard suggest that 1 meter of sea level rise by 2100 is liable to put 4 million people at risk. A more likely estimate of closer to 2 meters of sea level rise would put as many as 13 million at risk of inundation. And that does not include people inland at risk of riverine flooding. So it's also poignant, I think, that America's low-income and BIPOC communities are going to bear a really disproportionate share of damage from these extreme weather events. This massive shuffle or relocation over time is going to mean that many communities across the U.S. must be willing to welcome the resettlement of those displaced in their midst. And so that's what the book tries to tackle.
It's fascinating because you examine two big issues in the book. One was the emerging predicament of U.S. climate migrants. Where are these people going to go? What's it going to be like? How are we going to prepare? And the other is the plight of America's small towns and small cities. And what I found really fascinating in the book was how you kind of dovetailed the two and found a solution for the two together. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's really well said and very important. I see that there is an opportunity, a win-win opportunity that could be found by resettling those dislodged in small cities and towns and trying to suggest that there are alternatives to overstressing the typical cities. 3 cities in Texas or Duluth, Minnesota, Atlanta, upstate New York cities that could bear the brunt of resettlement. And as a function of that, they can sustain climate gentrification, meaning rising housing costs and tightening job markets that would displace some of the existing residents.
So the gist of your argument, if I understand it correctly, is we need to start preparing some certain places in the country now. Or maybe another way to put this is there's opportunity for maybe places in the country that are not heavily populated, that don't have much economic activity, to start getting ready now for climate migration.
Absolutely. And I see that is made possible by the advent of remote work. We are going to have to accommodate really exponentially large waves of people in these climate safer locations. And in doing so, we're going to need to retrofit, adapt, and renew many of these small settlements, of course, in climate favorable areas. And it's evident that we will need settlements that will be eager to welcome newcomers to prospectively restore downtown vitality. Many studies show that immigrant newcomers to large cities and small have boosted economies. They can really act to refuel the status of a rural economy. So the book does focus on how some of these smaller cities and towns have themselves focused on place-sensitive, wealth-building local strategies. And I talk a lot about local activism. The book encourages those places that have shown bottom-up local leadership, that have built organizational capacity to manage their township. And many of these towns really have assets that are often based in their community connectedness and social bonds. I think that's very important.
Can you offer some examples of what some towns or cities have done?
Yeah. I'm going to start with Ord, Nebraska, small town. It underwent a very significant economic downturn, and it imposed a 1% tax increment finance to start to create capital for rebuilding. They also established a leadership academy in town, specifically to cultivate young people's capabilities. They further promoted local purchasing. This led to a housing rehabilitation program, and the outcome was great. In 1 decade, they managed to gain 54% of their population in 30-plus-year-olds. That's great because it's the youth who the towns have been hemorrhaging. Another important one, Emporia, Kansas. They used new market and historic preservation tax credits. They also used the state exemption on property tax for solar installations. That made a major difference for them in terms of tax credits. And so they underwent a major Main Street rehabilitation. One last one, a small, tiny town upstate New York, it advertised to developers. And a very far-thinking young developer came in, rehabbed 20 buildings on Main Street. And he got his return from the rental of apartments above the stores. But it really refurbished entirely the town and made it a desirable place, especially for aging farmers to retire to.
Was this the town where the developer offered lower rents for businesses that
Yes.
stayed open at night? Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was trying to really revitalize that main street, that kind of come into town and creating a real community feel.
It really worked, and I think it's a great formula for many other towns to involve the private sector. The private sector can sort of see the potential in many of these towns with assets and resources, and they can be part of this rejuvenation. So I think the American Planning Association is really putting forward the notion that as we develop or redevelop our towns, we should be thinking about receiving the climate displaced and really thinking about how that can be best served.
Yeah, I really loved your focus on Main Street, the concept of Main Street too, because I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we have a Main Street that was transformed into a walking mall, and that really turned the city around. I mean, it just became a meeting place. It's a big meeting place for everybody in the community. Also, I just have a love of small towns with the nice main streets. I live near another one, Gordonsville, Virginia, where actually a private investor came in and really invested in a lot of something similar to what you were talking about, where she gave businesses that she thought would be helpful in revitalizing the main street lower rents. And so it's just become a really nice, beautiful main street with lots of nice restaurants and just different things going on there that attract you to it. But talk a little bit more about that concept of the main street. I know you talked about Midwest. Some of those Midwest towns are particularly, they're great places to revitalize the Main Street because they have nice wide streets and trees and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, for example, Madison, Indiana really leveraged its historic assets. I think it had an old hotel. It had other really attractive buildings that had long been vacant, and they were able to attract some 270 local businesses just through local agency and using the tax credits. So that's one. I can think of another, West Windsor, Vermont, which has a main street, and it's proximate to a ski resort, which had closed. And then, of course, the property values in town had plummeted. So the community took the initiative to buy the ski resort and with NGO support, and they found that their housing prices actually doubled. I think that a lot of these towns can also work with regional commissions and work as a network of several towns across an area, particularly to do things like boosting housing.
You also get into energy, the favorite topic of this audience in the book. Well, it's interesting. I actually pulled out some things that you wrote about because you came to the same kind of conclusions that my listeners have come to about how we should pursue energy. This is a quote from the book. Importantly, many new and upgraded services can become more dispersed, i.e. distributed, instead of being solely dependent on centralized power generation and water treatment facilities. They can become smarter at the same time, working in tandem with older legacy systems. Examples include on-site water treatment, green infrastructure, and the development of renewables with microgrids and storage. So tell me a little bit about what your thinking is on energy for communities that are serving climate migrants and how you sort of came to these conclusions.
For sure, I think small cities and towns are promising places as a proving ground for a near net zero urbanism. I think communities are successfully hosting solar and wind farm projects. They can receive development fees and taxes from the wind or solar developers. They can get lease payments. But importantly, it also puts people to work building out that infrastructure. And I think I note in the book that since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, some 100,000 jobs have been created in renewables across 40 states.
Yes.
I emphasize that America's utility sectors have to decarbonize and they have to sequester carbon, within an ever-narrowing window of time. And so the focus is on, as you say, the water systems, but we have now the growth of data farms. We have AI really taking a big bite out of our energy systems. There's some really good examples of where this is done, starting with wind power. The Midwest has plentiful wind power potential, and it is somewhat today inhibited by an inadequate grid. But we have wind in the Northeast, particularly offshore wind, which thankfully has been reinstated.
Yes.
As a major project. We're very grateful for that.
Yes. That was the project was it New Jersey?
Yeah, it's off Long Island in New Jersey. Yeah. And it will eventually stretch all the way up to Maine, according to some estimates of where this power can be taken from. With respect to wind power, a couple of examples. Starting with this tiny little town of Rockport, Missouri, near the Nebraska line, there was an article about it in the New York Times. They partnered with the entity John Deere, who does agricultural equipment and is getting into the wind business. They hosted together 4 turbines, and that provides some 125% of the town's demand. And they get extra revenue from selling the excess. The other one I note is the town of Carbon County, Wyoming.
Ironic name.
It hosts the excavation and utilization of oil, gas, and coal. And they installed utility-scale wind, claimed a budget surplus, and that predictable income was able to supplement local public services and serve school districts as well. The same can be said of solar farms, of course. My preference is to see, and I advocate for, something called agrivoltaics. I'm sure your audience is familiar with this, but for those not, it's the space under and between the arrays that can be planted with crops like sorghum or alfalfa, or even a range of vegetables, fruits, and nuts, or just simply native grasses that are great carbon sinks. So we're seeing the establishment of this as one way to produce these 2 revenue streams. And I've noted in the book that in Michigan, there's an organization that established a mobile grazing service for ecosystem management on solar farms, where owners have paired livestock with solar arrays. That's another popular 2 revenue arrangement.
Yes. And I've noticed you advocate for a bottom-up approach. I have a quote from you from actually an article we did back in August where I interviewed you, and you said it has to be ground up. I mean, we can give the spark to these local communities and suggest a way forward, but they need the wherewithal. They don't really have the capacity, many of them. So it's an interesting situation to be in. We encourage communities to do this, but it's hard for them to do this, right? It's hard for them to create local energy or do a lot of these other things because there are funding obstacles.
Absolutely. Yeah. Numbers of them are encouraging the location of tech sector companies in more rural economies. And one example is Newtown, Iowa. They renovated an old Whirlpool machine factory for the manufacture of turbine blades. So a lot of towns are looking to the tech sector as good anchor businesses, enterprises. But yeah, I think, it has to be bottom up. There's one example of Morris, Minnesota, where it began, and it's a very conservative town hosting a university, and the students started a composting organization, and it began to suggest that they could do more. And the university hosted some turbines. They've gone to solar power. They've even moved to geothermal heating. And now Morris, Minnesota, with the help of its sister city in Germany, actually, is really undertaking very aggressive ecologically and progressive energy strategies. They have an eco-industrial park. They're doing district heating. So it can start small, and it begins to suggest itself to the community that this can be a way of not only repowering, but also bringing other local enterprises to town.
Yeah, district heating is an interesting one because it's a way to serve several buildings at once in a community from one source. So it's a very efficient approach. It's used a lot in Europe, but not as much in the United States, although there's certainly a movement toward building more in the United States, more district energy in the United States now.
There's a wonderful example in Oberlin, Ohio, and they have just announced that the college has gone net zero energy, but they work together with the town to install geothermal heating and cooling and district heating. So the town and the college and its dormitories and classrooms are all served on the same loop. It's quite an achievement, a big investment, but a great achievement.
You have so many interesting projects in this book. How long did it take you to write this book? It must have been a tremendous amount of research.
The research is the fun part, I have to say. I got sucked into it and encouraged by a colleague, but I got sucked into it and I started looking at local news items. There's some great rural journals that have great examples. And so that's how I found some of these different opportunities. I read about something called the Solar Commons. It's a very innovative community trust ownership of a solar array, and it's an agreement among the community members who will together, they're going to fund this solar farm in a field or on rooftops, pay a vendor for installation and commissioning, but the members are going to pass the savings that they reap on their electric bills back to the community trust. And the savings then become commonly held wealth that can go towards other local improvements. I really recommend the Solar Community Project. I believe they've developed an open source toolkit for other towns that want to try this trust ownership model.
Yeah, so there's a term for that we use a lot called community solar. Although the project or the approach, the model you're describing, sounds like it's completely community driven. Community solar at times is more developer driven, and the developer shares the savings with the community. But I know there is movement out there by communities to actually build their own and capture more of the savings. So that's a very interesting model.
Yeah, but as you say, community choice aggregation of solar, for example, where the towns procure the bulk power supply. One example, really successful here in the state of New York, in Westchester County, has aggregated a number of villages and towns into this community choice and are providing renewable power. I think 10 states in New England and Maryland, Virginia, Illinois, California are places where this is happening.
Mm-hmm. Yes, especially California. It's a big one.
Yeah.
Really big. Yeah, it's a very interesting model. So, like a lot of people I talked to who have written books in the last year or so, they talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and how that will change things. So we're in a strange period now where we're not sure if the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be around. As we're recording this, there's a lot of changes and cuts in the Inflation Reduction Act that are being considered based on a House bill that passed, and it's now before the Senate. By the time this is live, who knows where that will stand and what funding will still be available. So things have changed since you wrote the book. What does this all mean to your thesis?
It means that, gutting the IRA doesn't just jeopardize our climate goals. It really decimates a growing workforce, particularly in the heartland and beyond. So what to do? Simply a greater focus on private investment, corporate contributions, philanthropic awards can go towards creating the capacity of the town to get the funding. And then, of course, we're going to still rely on state and local funding. For example, New York State has just allocated some $200 million for small town revitalization. I believe that the company T-Mobile has a hometown grant program. Some of the progressive realtor corporations and investment trusts may be interested as well in providing some incentives. And I do emphasize in the book, particularly, that we need to look to the philanthropy sector to jumpstart pilot projects. We need instances that people can see and hear about. And I think that the philanthropic sector should really be working more closely together to create maybe a national foundation that can begin to serve this need. The private foundations have traditionally underinvested in rural areas. They're more urban-based, they're more familiar with metropolitan problems. But I believe that if they reorient some of their funding, rural locales can be really important testing grounds for social and economic improvements from renewable energy. They can give capital or they can give credit. And also they can help finance consulting experts who can create trial programs.
Very good point. I mean, there's a lot of despair in the energy industry right now about the industry really began to create plans around the IRA. And so there's a sense of despair. But I think the point you're making is that there are the resources, there are ways to pivot, and that's kind of where people need to start looking right now. It's fascinating to me, too. I was thinking about this as I was reading your book, that there is so much emphasis on urban redevelopment and helping out poor urban communities. But the truth is, rural communities really need a lot of help. And based on the premise of your book, that these places are going to become greater population centers, we really need to start thinking about that right now, because it's not that far away. What are you thinking in terms of timing?
Timing. Well, I think we're going to start to see more massive population dislodgement beginning as early as the 60s and 70s. It's going to be much sharper towards the turn of the century. And that's not a lot of time for planning at all. It takes a long time to raise the funding, to encourage these towns to act on their own behalf with an eye to regrowing their lost population. So, the timing is crucial. And I dare say I may be the first book that's really talked about the idea of revitalizing rural areas just for the purpose of housing climate refugees.
Yes. Thank you for writing this book. You're getting the conversation started. That's the first step. So tell us, where can people find your book?
It's available online through all the tried and true sources. There's Amazon, where it's available as a paperback or as an ebook for a lot less. I tried to keep the price down on this book. Barnes & Noble, basically most of the big distributors will have it. So, yeah, I've been trying to get the word out and talk about it whenever I can, but I specifically appreciate this audience and am very grateful for having the chance to talk about some of these issues with you.
We're very grateful that you came here and grateful that you wrote the book. For the listeners, again, the title of the book is Revitalize, Resettle, How Main Street USA Can Offer New Beginnings for America's Climate Displaced. And that's by Hillary Brown. So thank you, Hillary, for being here. And I hope we can talk again, maybe, in a year or so, and see if there's been any movement on this important look at rural climate migration.
Yes, thank you. I may be working on a pilot project, which we'll be able to talk about probably next year.
Fantastic. I look forward to that.
So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today on the Energy Changemakers podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think differently about the role of distributed energy in our society. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform and consider leaving us a review. You can help us shape the dialogue around energy. Go to energychangemakers.com, subscribe to our newsletter, and join our community. Together, we can make a real difference in how quickly we can make our grid local, equitable, and clean.